Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm Ukrainian Canadian. Today is April 25th, 2025, and let's get to the news and updates happening in Ukraine and Russia, shall we? So I'll talk about three things today. First, we'll talk about this massive arsenal that was destroyed by the Ukrainians a few days ago and some satellite images from yesterday. Also, we'll talk about some high-value targets being eliminated in Russia by Ukrainian intelligence services. And last but not least, we obviously have to talk about the peace process that is currently, if we may call it, being mediated by the Americans, and what is currently ongoing with the last few days being very, very up and down with a lot of announcements, a lot of visits. So we have to cover that as well. First, I want to talk about the 51st Main Missile and Artillery Directorate Arsenal. And we have some satellite images coming from Radio and Nukes here, which showcased that about a little bit over 50% of this ammunition depot was destroyed by the Ukrainians. And, what you're seeing here, the rest is either being damaged or intact, but I would be very surprised if the ones in green wouldn't be impacted in one way or the other by this massive explosion that occurred. And if you guys saw the images and videos that were shared by the locals, it looked like a tactical nuke was dropped on top of this facility. That's how big the explosion was. Similar to what we saw back in the fall when another massive arsenal was completely obliterated by the Ukrainians, the Toropets one, a very modern facility that I believe was built back in 2018 or 2019, and the Ukrainians also completely obliterated that arsenal in Toropets. So I think that actually even the ones in green have been impacted in one way or the other. And based on reports, this facility could store up to 300,000 tons of ammunition. It's likely that the Russians didn't store the maximum amount here. Let's be conservative. Probably they were storing around half of that, so about 150,000, maybe 200,000 tons. And so if over 50 to 60% was destroyed, we could look anywhere between 75,000 to 100,000 tons that were effectively deleted by the Ukrainians a few days ago. A massive loss for the Russians. We also know that they were storing North Korean missiles and Iranian missiles that were transferred from both nations, which also explains why the Russians have been increasing their ballistic missile attacks against Ukraine. And even yesterday, we saw another unfortunate terrorist attack by the Russians where they attacked Kyiv and destroyed a whole apartment building, killing over 10 people in the process. And so that's basically Russia for you, but limiting their capabilities and their regular strikes is a very, very important thing. So thankfully, Ukraine is working really hard on that. And this obviously will impact Russia's spring and summer offensive capabilities. They were storing a lot of ammunition here that was meant to be used for their offensive in the summer. So Ukraine continues to work on that. We also know that Ukraine has been working on destroying Russian logistics over the last few weeks. They've been dropping a lot of bombs, the French hammer bombs, on key routes and roads and bridges that the Russians would be using if they were to go on the offensive in northern Ukraine and northeastern Ukraine. So they've also been striking a lot of these roads, bridges, military HQs, and administrative buildings to really hinder and limit Russian capabilities over the next few months. So, fabulous news here. And another fabulous update is Ukraine also continuing with its successful elimination of high-value targets in Russia. There's actually two of them that occurred today. Ukraine liquidated a Russian general near Moscow today by detonating his car as he started driving away from his apartment building, and the car was detonated. He was in charge of the planning of operations in Ukraine. He also took part, based on some images that were shared today, he took part in the Normandy talks between Russia, Ukraine, Europe back in 2019. So he was definitely a high-value target. And another Russian was liquidated today in Bryansk Oblast. Again, through the same method. He was the chief designer of the Krasukha electronic warfare system, and he was liquidated with a car bomb as well. Actually, it wasn't today. That happened on the night of April 17th. I apologize. So this happened a little bit over a week ago. And so again, he was the head of the design bureau at the Bryansk electromechanical plant. So Ukraine continues to hunt down and bring to justice the Russian collaborators, generals, designers, scientists, propagandists, etc. And as mentioned before, Ukraine will not stop at bringing to justice those people, those collaborators that have helped the Putin regime to continue with the brutal murder of innocent civilians and who have helped Putin start this war. So that is, again, wonderful news. And, Ukraine would like to bring them to justice through international criminal courts when that is not possible, well, the only thing left is the elimination of these targets, just like Mossad did back after World War II, where they were hunting down every single Nazi collaborator to bring them to justice. And last but not least, we have to talk about the peace process that is currently being mediated by the Americans, but it might end very soon. We now have some leaks, according to Reuters, of the US offer, which is quite frankly unacceptable in my opinion, but I wanted to share with you guys. And we have also the counter offer by the Ukrainians and European countries, according again to Reuters. So this is a leak. There's still a few details that could get ironed out in the next few days, but I'm pretty certain that this is what is being proposed by the Americans. So what we're seeing here is that, of course, in terms of ceasefire, the Americans are proposing a permanent ceasefire. Both sides immediately engage in technical implementation negotiations. However, the most important here is security guarantees and territory, which is quite frankly unacceptable terms for Ukraine. Ukraine somehow receives robust security guarantee, whatever that means. There is no details as to what that entails. Then Ukraine will not seek to join NATO, and they've based on rumors that Russia wants it to be ever. And also Ukraine can at least pursue EU membership. But the most, I think, unacceptable one is that the US will provide recognition of Russian control over Crimea, Luhansk, and the Russian controlled parts of Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Kherson. Ukraine regains territory in Kharkiv Oblast, which doesn't even account for 0.001% of Ukrainian territory. Whatever Russia currently controls in the Vovchansk area is very small. And for what Russia's getting in return, it doesn't even compare. I guess a positive thing that is being offered by the United States is that Ukraine will regain control over the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant through US-controlled administration of the plant, and the electricity will be distributed to both sides. And also the Kakhovka Dam, but we know that the Kakhovka Dam has been destroyed by the Russians back in June of 2023, so there isn't much to discuss here. This is not really much being given to Ukraine. And also they're mentioning here that the sanctions on Russia resulting from this conflict since 2014 will be removed, and apparently Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, but they don't mention who is going to compensate Ukraine. So now we see the Ukrainian-European counter-proposal here, which seems to be a little bit more fair. Again, what is important for Europe and Ukraine is that both sides commit to a full unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on land, and at sea, something that was already proposed over 2 months ago. That both sides immediately enter into negotiations on technical implementation with the participation of the US and European countries. Also, the ceasefire monitoring, they want it to be led by the United States and supported by other third countries. And Russia must unconditionally return all deported and legally displaced Ukrainian children. In the exchange of all prisoners of war, the principle of all for all. And Russia must release all civilian prisoners. They also want Ukraine to receive robust security guarantees, including from the United States, because we know that here it's just very vague statements, but the US doesn't want to guarantee anything in terms of security. But they also want the United States to step up here. An Article 5-like agreement, although there's still no consensus, unfortunately, among allies on NATO membership. That is something that Ukraine has mentioned in the past, that they're willing to compromise. Okay, we don't get NATO, but at least give us some robust security guarantees, clear weapon deliveries, clear cooperation in terms of building and making weapons and ammunition, etc. Right, some cooperation is needed here. Also, no restrictions on the Ukrainian defense forces. Obviously, one thing that they agree is Ukraine can continue its accession to the EU, which again, likely the Russians will never accept, because that is, again, the whole point of this war is to force Ukraine back into the sphere of influence of Russia. And if they are allowed to pursue accession to the EU, that is problematic for the Russians. We also know this war is about the full destruction of Ukrainian sovereignty. And if Ukraine gets to decide its sovereignty to go with the EU, that is problematic for the Russians. So you're seeing that, again, this is one of the reasons why this peace process will fail, because the Russians will simply not accept even a basic thing like Ukraine pursuing EU membership. Also, territory. So here, territorial issues will be discussed and resolved only after a full and unconditional ceasefire. Not recognizing beforehand Russian control over these territories, but only when Russia is fully committed to ceasefire, where we're seeing a goodwill gesture by the Russians, then we can start talking about the modalities of who controls what for now. And that is a fair, I think, proposal, rather than going blindly and say, okay, Russia, you have Crimea, you have Luhansk, you have all these territories, and then we hope that you're going to agree to ceasefire. You really think that the Russians will agree to ceasefire? Absolutely not. They just got a massive deal where they got a bunch of territory, and yet they're not forced to commit to a ceasefire afterwards, right? So that is problematic, and a very bad offer by the US, quite frankly. And last but not least, another proposal that is absolutely necessary is that Russia needs to pay and compensate Ukraine for all the damage that they have done by using sovereign assets, Russian assets, that will remain frozen until they compensate damage to Ukraine. Or by not using them, but at least forcing the Russians to compensate. And only after they've done that, they have been helping with the reconstruction of Ukraine to then release these sovereign assets back to Russia. We know that Russia's never going to accept that. So what I'm seeing here is that, and actually, by the way, this is an image of Witkoff today. He again flew for the fourth time, I think, to Moscow, met with the Russians, got his little propaganda booklet from the Russians of what he had to transfer to Trump, and then he walked around Moscow with a big smile. Again, completely unacceptable in my opinion, but that's beyond the point here. I know that the peace process will fail because the Americans are just being hacked by the Russians right now. They're spewing pro-Russian propaganda, and they're willing to give up everything to Russia and force Ukraine to agree and capitulate. That is ridiculous. And so I think that Trump right now is preparing the ground to blame everything on Ukraine and Europe for the failure of this peace process. We've already seen a hint. I believe it was last week where Marco Rubio said that there will come a time where the US will have to decide whether it continues with the mediation, the peace process, or it will completely entirely stop this. So what I'm seeing is a clear message by the United States that they don't want to continue with this process, and they'll just blame it on Ukraine because it's the easier, perceived weaker side here. And again, it is very easy to understand now the US approach, the Trump approach, when you consider that Trump, one, doesn't care about Ukraine, two, clearly admires strongmen like Putin. He seeks their validation and is easily manipulated by them, like Putin. You're seeing that Witkoff is just an extension of Trump. He tells Trump what Trump wants to hear. He doesn't tell him the facts. Trump has access to the best intelligence. He could fact check everything that the Russians are telling Witkoff, but he doesn't do it because he likes what Witkoff tells him. And that's problematic, and extremely problematic when you're the president of the United States, when you need to rule based on facts, knowledge, and not just your personal feelings and what you want to hear. And last but not least, there's many other points, but he has a limited understanding of how the world works. And we've seen that with the tariffs. We've seen that with, of course, Ukraine, geopolitics, and conflicts. Like, he doesn't have an idea and a clue of how things work. And, the tariffs is probably the best example to my American audience. You're seeing how much havoc his administration is currently doing on the economy, on the stock market, and they're talking to the Trump administration. Be a few days ago, CEOs of Target, Home Depot, Walmart, they met with Trump and told him that our stores are going to be empty soon because we're dealing so much with China. And so again, if it was a normal intellectual president that actually understood what he's doing, he definitely would have understood that if he had implemented this Liberation Day policy, fighting economic war against pretty much the entire planet. But apparently to Trump, that was too complicated to understand. And they did not have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. They had no contingencies. They really thought that every single country would just bend the knee and accept American terms. That's not how the world works. And not everything revolves around money. There's also dignity, there's geopolitics involved, and many other things. And clearly, Trump doesn't really understand that. So my last parting words here is that I've already been saying this many times, but if the US pulls out entirely of this process, then it might be even better. It might actually remove a lot of these limitations that are imposed onto Ukraine. And again, as I've said many times, the United States unfortunately has become part of the problem rather than being part of the solution at ending this war. So I think that if the US pulls out entirely, it's going to be for the better. And again, we're seeing that what Putin failed to do with Europe, Trump has been able to do with Europe. That is kickstarting and really making Europe realize that actually they're on themselves. They by themselves. They're on the same boat as with Ukraine, and nobody's going to come to save them. The US has made it very clear that they're not going to be out there helping Europe anymore, assisting them militarily. We're already seeing Pete Hegseth mentioning that we might even withdraw all of our troops in the next few years from Europe, and that their security is on them. We no longer want to provide security to Europe. And so I think that is also, there is a silver lining behind this, because Europe now starts being conscious of its power at growing its military capabilities. And I think that's really necessary, because Europe for the last few decades has been really frozen and always dependent on what Washington decided to do or not to then act, right? But now Europe now realizes that they need to act, and they cannot anymore be dependent on what Washington decides or what they don't, because they are fully pulling out. So I think that is good news in my opinion, and it will be for the better in my opinion as well. Of course, there still will have to be some sort of collaboration with the United States. There will have to be some intelligence sharing, but it will be very limited, and it's not going to be the same as it was before, clearly. So with all that, guys, I hope you enjoyed my update. Again, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate your support for this channel. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think about this proposal by the United States and counter proposal by Ukraine, Europe. But certainly, I think it's going to fail with the way that we're seeing things here. I'm not seeing the Russians ever agreeing to it. We already know that the Russians, believing them and trusting them is not respecting oneself. They will never agree to a ceasefire. They'll never agree to ending this war until they fully destroy Ukraine. That's their main goal. And they'll continue manipulating, playing kind of the carrot and the stick situation with the Americans, making them believe that we're very involved in this process, but in reality, they're just manipulating. And I think that even Putin himself can't believe how easy it is to hack and manipulate Trump, and that he's being totally played by the Russians. That's what you get when you hire a gang of amateurs like Trump's team, unfortunately. So with all that, guys, thank you so much. Continue supporting Ukraine, continue supporting the various drone funds in the description below. And with all that, I will see you in the next one. Slava Ukraini!